Welcome back to everyone joining online. Session 11, Climate Safe Housing, will explore the intersection of the climate and the housing crisis, from the growing frequency of natural disasters through to the need to adapt homes to changing weather conditions. Each of our speakers will have 5 minutes to share opening remarks, followed by questions from the commissioners based on what you have shared in your submission and here today. At the conclusion of this session, I will summarise what we have heard and draw it to a close. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge and thank all our speakers for being here today. I also want to take the opportunity to remind our participants that some of the topics covered may be heavy and that we can take a break at any time. If you need to pause or turn off your camera for any reason, please feel free to do so. So we've got Brendan from Brisbane and Glenn from the Northern Rivers. And is Nicole there?
I'm here, and I'm also noting, Doug, that we've got Casey as well, I believe, who will also...
Oh, Casey, sorry.
Today.
Okay. So let me just get the speakers list. I'm sorry, I'm still trying to grab everything here. So Brendan, would you like to kick off?
Yes, thanks, Doug. Hello, everyone. My name is Brendan Donoghue. I come from the Yagra and Turrbal lands, and I'm very glad to be with you here today to share my experience and hopefully provide some meaningful information. So I am a person that is totally blind, has been since birth, and have a number of other balance and other disabilities. And I was a part of the 2022 floods that occurred here in Brisbane, and essentially was involved in that. I live in a multi-storey community housing building with 146 vulnerable tenants with disabilities and multiple other challenges, such as mental health and homelessness. And our building was significantly damaged. Our medical centre and our other facilities, such as our gym, was damaged due to water and due to not being prepared. So as a person with disability, I was under the impression that community housing providers had disaster management plans in place for people with disabilities. So disaster management plans are plans that are enacted to support people with disabilities in their hour of need by putting in place reasonable adjustments and other supports that they may need in terms of evacuation and other information, such as me being totally blind, as I said. There was movement of disaster management exit points in the building. There were other facilities that were not made available, such as lifts, which enabled me to have to take stairs. And none of this information was provided in an accessible format. And no one from the community housing provider or the support provider in my building here thought to check on me for at least a week afterwards. And when they did check up on me, it was, we're hoping you are doing okay. And there was no sort of support or assistance provided or any help given. Obviously, I live in the almost the center of the CBD. My unit gets extremely hot during the summer, and the costs of providing energy efficiency is obviously a lot higher to somebody who has a disability such as myself, because I need Google enabled and speech enabled devices that I can talk to, and certain devices that are accessible that talk. And they are much more expensive due to the multiple products that need to be produced over a small market. So I went ahead and installed an air conditioner in my unit because it was getting bearably very too hot in my unit. And this cost me $1,000 extra than anyone standardly would have to put in to their unit due to the appliance I needed accessibility. And to a lot of people's information, the NDIS does not support anything to do with climate, and doesn't have any sort of climate-based energy initiatives to support people with disability in their homes. Disappointingly, after raising these issues with the community housing provider and the support provider, nothing has changed. There have been no disaster management plans being introduced, and they continuously say that disaster management plans are not good, and they continuously push back on actually even working through a consultation and design process for those disaster management plans to be introduced throughout the building for all tenants. So disappointing that we keep taking these steps forward, and then we take one step back, and really wishing that I can provide this information here today to give food for thought and for change to occur in our sectors. That's my opening remarks. Happy to take any questions.
Brendan, we'll hear from Glenn and others, and then come back to you. So is Glenn, are you online?
Yes, I'm on your screen.
Yeah, good on you, Glenn. Would you like to make your submission, then we'll come back?
Yep. Thanks, Doug. Thanks for your sharing, Brendan. Really appreciated what you shared. So yeah, I'm Glenn from Northern Rivers, and I guess what I'm speaking to is my experience of the housing crisis, both prior to and post flood, February 22. As a way to engage whoever's viewing this, I really like to ask curious questions, and I may pause from time to time because I really want to invite whoever's viewing this and listening to this to think about this whole theme. So the first question I wanted to ask is why are you actually here today? Why are you here attending this webinar? The reason I'm here today is that in 10 or 20 years' time, when my children make a comment to me like, "Dad, what did you do? What did you do to help contribute to reducing the housing crisis? What did you do to help minimize or maximize the accessibility to housing?" Well, I want to be able to say to them that I did something, and participating and contributing here today is one way I feel I can contribute to forming concrete recommendations on how to address the availability of housing and the affordability of housing, So to give you a bit of context, I've lived up in this region for about 24 years, and I've been certainly aware of natural disasters. We've had floods over the years, we've had drought, we've had fires. So, you know, it was something I really considered before I got a loan from the bank to purchase the house in the town where I live. The other thing is that prior to the flood, I was already experiencing housing stress. I was coordinating rural regional projects across this region, but as a sole income earner for my children and I was still spending at least 60% of my income on the mortgage, which was very challenging. So the housing crisis in some ways was escalated after the flood, because sadly the water actually went up to my gutter on my house, in the front of the house, up all the way up to the gutter. And I had probably about maybe a minute or two to get out of the house with my children, and I pretty much lost the whole lot. I did have insurance, and I was easily able to get insurance when I bought the house, because I deliberately bought a house that was close to the 1 in 100 year flood level in our town. And the house I bought was 110 years old and had never flooded in recorded history in its life. So I felt very confident that I'd been sensible about considering the natural disasters of flooding in my area. And so I was pretty shocked when I discovered that in February 28 that my house went under. I've just realised how fast 5 minutes can go. So in terms of my lived experience informing recommendations I would make, the first one I would do is that, in terms of housing, if a person like my family is displaced and has to relocate elsewhere, it would be really helpful with housing affordability to waive stamp duty and conveyancing costs for people who have been forced to relocate because of the loss of their home. The second thing I would recommend is that to pivot land use restrictions. Myself, and I can't tell you how many other people who have tried to relocate either by moving their home to a new block of land, or by trying to build an affordable home of a smaller size, like 60 metres squared instead of 120 or 150, that various developers have as caveats to buy the land. In terms of insurance, at the moment, my good news is I am relocating to a home in a month after being in a caravan for 2.5 years. I've got insurance quotes are up to $9,500 for the home that I'm moving to, not because it's been flooded in the past, but because it's in a postcode where other houses have flooded. That's incredibly challenging for me at the moment. $9,500 it makes, even though the irony is my family's helped me out to actually own a home, it's still very challenging when prices are like that. So my recommendation would be government to consider backing or guaranteeing insurance for people who are discovered to be living in areas vulnerable to natural disaster. Embed people with lived experience in decision-making processes and decision-making committees that relate to housing, the housing crisis and housing accessibility. In terms of housing after a natural disaster, develop fast-track processes for organisations applying for funding, or local organisations that are trying to help people like myself to to return to stable housing. And I think it would be really helpful in terms of returning to housing. I caught up with a friend this morning. He's at day 848 and still waiting for his claim to be settled for his house. So 848 days, he still has not had his claim settled. And so my recommendation is that there be industry standards around fair and reasonable timelines for house claims to be settled, so that people like my friend aren't struggling to find somewhere to live purely because they're waiting for a claim to settle.
Glenn, thanks for that.
Thank you.
I'm sorry we're restricted for time, but these were all very important points you made. Casey, we'll move to you, and we'll come back to you, Glenn, so that you can expand a bit more. Casey?
Thank you so much, Doug and Nicole and Glenn and Brendan, for your very valuable insights there. And I just want to acknowledge all the elders past, present and emerging of all the mob within the Bundjalung Nation on which I reside. Yeah, just to let you know that I have decided to have myself completely de-identified, because I felt that living and working in a region which is very large but feels quite small at times, and being able to be completely open and honest, particularly as a woman surviving domestic and family violence, that I wouldn't be able to do that if I was identified. My family and I had been suffering. I'm a full-time single parent, and that means that there is only one set of income coming into my home, and every time I go out to earn money, unless I am running my own business or working with an amazing employer, my child needs to be in some form of childcare, which usually costs money, you know, especially if you're looking at nanny fees and different things like that. So that means that my one set of income can sometimes look more like 75% or half. And in the time leading up to the floods, I had been suffering significant housing stress for about 5 years, as a renter, with rental prices increasing by hundreds of dollars. And that has been like an exponential upward curve every 12 to 24 months, which means being moved on at the end of every lease, because the landowners know that they can get an extra $100 or $200. Since the floods hit and so much of our housing stock dropped out of the rental market, that has just gotten worse and worse and worse. 80% of my income is now going on the house that I pay for before I can even walk out the door, let alone, you know, the fact that I've had to cut things back, you know, simple things like eating meat because of affordability. So my family and I we lost everything. We were helicoptered out of our home, which we'd only recently moved into because of losing our home due to this exact issue that I was speaking of. And when we moved into the home that we were helicoptered out of, we would never have actually lived in that home, except that there was just so few options that were not just affordable, but that I could bring animals to in our region, because the supply is so low and the demand is so high for often terrible homes that you live in. They are uninsulated. They are far too expensive. They are full of mold. They are cold in the winter and hot in the summer. You know, often things don't work. My current home has lights don't work, extractor fans don't work. It's uninsulated. It's bloody freezing at the moment, and yet I'm paying so much for it. You know, we wouldn't have been living in a home that we had to get helicoptered out of on a floodplain if I had had some choice, but I didn't. The other thing that has been extraordinary, so we've moved, it was 13 times until we were able to finally actually get a long-term rental. And unfortunately, post-disaster, most of the disaster housing that was available was not available to us because we did have animals. So that meant that I had to try and reach out to my community, who were all impacted themselves, most of them. So it really has been a very hard time. It also meant that I was particularly vulnerable because I had to publicly put a call out where I have been trying to keep our location very private due to this domestic violence issue, which meant that I was heavily targeted, and, you know, that has been a real burden for my family to bear. And I know I'm not the only one. The other thing that has become increasingly apparent to me is I'm desperate to get out of this horrible, horrible downward spiral to own a home. But as a full-time single parent, as I've mentioned before, unless I'm running my own business where I can be flexible to respond to the needs as a parent or as one parent of my child, where, you know, if they my children, if they get sick or if, you know, they have some needs, I'm the only person who can respond. If I'm self-employed, I cannot get a mortgage. It doesn't matter that I'm earning 3 times the amount as a self-employed business owner than that of somebody who is employed in a role. I will not be looked at to be able to get a mortgage. So I've now had to look at working a 60-hour week, running a 30-hour business that is going to actually be able to pay for a deposit and pay for a mortgage. I've had to go back to work for somebody else to be able to even just be looked at by a bank to get a mortgage. What that means is that I'm constantly getting sick. I'm constantly having to spread myself so thin that it's beyond belief, and just maintaining life. You know, life is very expensive when you're working that much because you literally just cannot, you know, you don't have the time to do the food prep or do the cost saving things that you really need to. So corners are cut in every direction, and it's just completely unsustainable.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Sorry, excuse me. But, you know, when it comes to the homes that are available as a renter, there are homes that are just, yeah, they shouldn't even really be offered on the market. But I would never want to say that, because in reality, we need them. We need to live in these dwellings that shouldn't really be lived in to the standards that they are, because otherwise we would be intense. And that is happening. I've got friends all over the place in caravans and in tents. And if we have to leave the region as single parents, it means we don't have any support when we get sick, or we need somebody to help us out with our kids. It means our kids are constantly having to start over, having to find new friends, and having to worry about where they're going to go to school or how they're going to have just some semblance of a normal childhood. When we're constantly at work, we can't give them the things that they deserve, which is being able to go and be fit and healthy and have a sporting team or have regular activities that they want to do, because we're constantly having to ship them around as we go and earn enough money just for the basics. Us renters, that's 30% of the Australian population. Us renters are given nothing or virtually nothing after the disaster hits. We were given very small grants, and I can tell you they don't cover much, especially when you're having to start over completely and when you're having to move constantly. Moving alone costs an absolute fortune to be able to do, especially when you're a sole person, because I can tell you trying to carry a couch on your own is damn near impossible. And so that's not even factored into. None of that's factored into. Of the 30% of people who are renting, us women and us sole parents, First Nations women, LGBTQIA+ women, women living with a disability, I think I said First Nations women, women surviving domestic and family violence, and women who come from migrant backgrounds or whose first language is not English are so incredibly adversely impacted. There is nothing that is out there for these people, for these women, and for other people like Brendan who are living with disabilities. There needs to be specific people who take that group, that cohort, and say, how can we make this group resilient before the next disaster? We know that floods are happening again. My family was evacuated for the 2019 fires. This is not our first disaster. My eldest is 10, and she has been living through both a fire, a pandemic, and floods. And, this has been her normal. And we have asked time and time again and been supported by different organizations who have had to say over and over again many times to us, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. If I wasn't as well resourced and educated as I am, I can honestly tell you, I don't know how we would have gotten through. We would have had to have left the region. And if we had have left the region, we would have no support. Thank you.
Good on you, Casey. And we will come back to you during questions. Nicole will be asking some questions. Thanks very much, Brendan, Glenn, and Casey. That was really powerful submissions. Nicole.
Thanks very much, Doug. And yes, I echo that. Thank you, Casey, Glenn, and Brendan. Really powerful and important insights you've shared already. I might go back to you, Brendan, to start with. Look, I was really moving and very enlightening as well to hear about, and shocking, quite frankly, to hear about the lack of a disability-specific emergency response plan in your housing. You didn't tell us actually how you did fare for that week between needing to, as I think I'm understanding, evacuate and then being checked on again. If that's something maybe that you could share with us, the impacts of your housing provider not having a plan in place to deal with that emergency event for you specifically.
Sure. So there was actually, we were almost required to evacuate, but we never got to that stage. But there were a couple of things that the housing provider put in place, such as a telephone line that went dead at 5 p.m. So supposedly nobody actually requires assistance after 5 p.m. in the evening. No information was circulated that downstairs there were certain people providing support to residents of the building. There was one delivery of food throughout the week, which I was not even provided with options of said certain food. I had to just take the food that they gave, even though it was not really suitable food for my certain health-related issues as well. And again, evacuation areas within the building that we were once taught were changed with visual signs that were placed up. In that I was not able to read them, so therefore had no knowledge or idea on where to go, even if I needed to evacuate. And as I said, due to the water coming and flooding our basement, the lifts had to be turned off, and there were staff carrying people in wheelchairs up the stairs to their units, because there was no way of getting said wheelchairs up to levels, because the only way is up the fire escape with stairs and lifts, which were turned off.
Thank you, Brendan. And then perhaps even more disturbing that you say there's no supports him. There's no plan been implemented yet.
I made a complaint to the said housing provider, which was then sent to the support provider, which then started an internal squabble between the two organisations, and nobody could work out where it sat. And at the end of it, it was, oh, well, you just have to cope with it.
Okay. Right. Thank you.
And essentially, they said, well, we'll deal with it when the next disaster comes along.
Right. Okay. I mean, and you made a number of other very insightful remarks in terms of dealing with chronic. I'm sorry, Brendan, I cut you off.
No, I was going to say, and I think the other really important thing here is to acknowledge that as I brought up before, that the National Disability Insurance Scheme does not have any disaster management or evacuation process within their planning division of creating an NDIS plan for more than 300,000 NDIS participants that are currently on the scheme, and therefore they have no disaster awareness training or knowledge if they come across anyone with a disability that may be in said position.
Yeah, I thought that's a really helpful point to make, Brendan. And if we've got time, I want to ask you some more about the particular impacts of, dealing with high heat and issues like that. But let's go to you now. Look, I have so many questions I could put to you as well. Thank you for coming and talking to us today. Let me ask you, though, about the proposals around temporary housing. I understand there's been mixed reports as to the efficacy and the adequacy and the number of the reusable, demountable or mobile homes that might be able that were deployed to, the Northern Rivers. But, there are suggestions that, for instance, the federal government should set up a bank of mobile homes that they can send around to disaster impacted regions. I hear what you said about getting an insurance payout, but there was nothing to rent, so you had to purchase a caravan. You've been living in that for 2.5 years. What's your view about how that temporary housing issue gets resolved post-disaster? Oh, you're muted, I think, Glenn.
Okay. I've got a few thoughts on that. Firstly, what I've tried to do is bring a trauma-informed lens in all the decisions that I've made for my family. And early on, I think I was approached. Service New South Wales contacted us asking if we wanted a housing pod to be placed in the backyard. And from a trauma point of view, it wasn't smart at all for my kids or I because of the terrifying experience we went through there. And down the track, I was also offered, Service New South Wales said, do I want to apply for a place in a housing pod village? But again, with the trauma-informed lens, with what my kids and I were going through, actually being able to stay somewhere with people that we knew who had room for us, even if we were in a caravan off grid, that was a more healthy option for what I thought would only be, maybe 6 months to a year. However, that part of my story is that because I was fortunate enough to get a claim accepted, because the bank needed most of the money to settle my mortgage, I ended up realizing unless I rebuilt my house myself, I wasn't going to be able to sell it to be able to afford to move somewhere else. So I did sell it, but I've actually spent a year and a half looking for somewhere to live that I could afford. And I feel privileged in that the only reason I've been able to afford somewhere is I actually had other family help me get this place. So in terms of your question around temporary accommodation, it relates to insurance processes, that there be reasonable and fair times, and that if those timelines aren't met for someone who's lucky enough to have the insurance, then act of grace payments should be made for the trauma and hardship of, I'm just thinking of my friend, 848 days is just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous, for an insurance claim. You know, so yeah, I can only speak from my own personal experience.
No,
Yeah.
I'm hearing what you
I think
said.
some of my recommendations I said earlier relate to it as well. And the other thing I would say, Nicole, is that I would strongly encourage government and non-governmental organisations involved in housing, particularly impacted due to a natural disaster, to look at best practice models from overseas. What are governments and non-governmental organisations and insurance companies doing, in Europe, in North America, in other countries around the world? What can we learn from them? Because the reality is natural disasters, at least from what I'm learning, they're going to happen again. This is going to the town where I am could get flooded again. So it's like, what are some real contingencies and strategies we can do to move forward?
Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, I think if I can just check in with you to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, one of the some of the feedback that you're giving me is that there might be a technical dwelling that is offered as part of the relief, such as a pod, but if it's offered without a context of what a family who's experienced trauma needs for their mental well-being as well as the physical shelter, then that's not going to work either. So I think that's a really have I understood you correctly?
Yeah. It is capturing what I'm saying, because it's with the uncertainty, the longer the time is in temporary accommodation, for me, that felt more challenging. If it's a very short time, because after the flood, losing everything, not even having clothes, just a pair of shorts that I got out in, it's like, and that a lot of people got out in, it's like just the basics: shelter, food, water, clothes. Now, but after a few weeks, having creating temporary accommodation options that have people engaging in a more trauma-informed way, I think it is a big piece that I'm trying to highlight here.
That's very
Yeah.
helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Because in my situation, ironically, I feel more traumatized by everything I've gone through since the flood than I do the actual flood event. And I know I'm not the only one that feels that way.
Yeah, well, thank you for speaking out. Casey, I would like to go to you now, and obviously, you're welcome to reframe any of the questions that I'm going to offer you to make sure, I want to know what you want to tell us. But I'm just really struck by the situation that you've described as a single parent with, the particular needs of having children who need to, retain their social networks and, presumably the companion animals as well. And that period post-flood, was the type of support that you were able to access, were there provisions that sort of recognize those particular additional needs that single parents with school-age children face?
No, so similar to what Glenn said, I can absolutely attest, and I've been trained in trauma-informed care, that I have suffered significantly, as has my child, far more trauma from the process after the flood, and not even from the initial days, but from the long-term process and the mishandling of that, than from the actual event itself. So for us, we lost most of our animals, which was incredibly heartbreaking. But the animals that we were able to rescue, that we self-organized to rescue, we unfortunately were given an option after the first 6 weeks that if we wanted emergency housing support, whether it was a caravan or anything at all that Service New South Wales offered, I would have to get rid of our animals. That was the only option given to me. There was no follow-up. There was no other extent of looking for another option. It was given to me, that news was delivered to me exactly like that one afternoon while I was crying on the phone saying, everything else has been exhausted. I don't have anything left in my savings. There's nothing that I can do. Please tell me, is there anything else? And they said, no, you have to get rid of your animals. Otherwise we can't help you. So the other awful experience that happened, so then we relied on friends, which we were so incredibly lucky, who, changed their living arrangements to be able to have us come and live in their homes or pay, a nominal fee for Airbnbs that they took off the market and things like this. In order, after a year, to be able to access the pods while we were still in unstable housing, we were almost told that we could not have access to a pod because we had found we had rented privately, even though we were paying a nominal fee to friends who didn't have these as rental on the rental market at all. They had opened them up to us. And to be told that after a year and you're on your absolute last legs, you have no idea, will this be the week that we're in a tent? To be told, it's just so dehumanized to have to deal with these barriers that are being put up when there are so many barriers in the housing crisis we're in already, in a region which is so incredibly hard done by the housing crisis because of whatever it is, short-term holiday accommodation, constant disasters wrecking the homes that we can have, and because of the housing supply issue that we have here, that was incredibly unhelpful and really traumatic.
And
yeah,
Kate,
so those were some of the things I wanted to mention. Another thing I wanted to mention was just that we did end up living in a pod. We did manage to work through that and bypass that barrier through persistence. But once we were there, we were just thrown into this area which was terribly designed with a whole bunch of other traumatized people. There were no things like basics like having frosted windows on your bathroom. I had men looking into our bathroom windows. I had somebody grooming my child to the point where I wasn't comfortable for her to even sit on the balcony because he would leave presents and then sit in his van to watch her. And I tried reporting these issues, but you get to the point where you're so vulnerable that you don't want to report anything because you become the problem and they see you as a problem. And then the management of these areas start to treat you as a problem. So you really over and over and over again are shown that you're out on your own. And if you weren't well resourced before this disaster hit, then you are really in strife. And if you don't have capacity to self-advocate or to communicate well or to seek your own mental health support, then the downward spiral that you go on will for sure be incredibly traumatic and cause more and more long-term harm. And it's completely unnecessary.
right. Casey, if I may ask you another follow-up question, because I think it's critical to explain, the types of particular support that families, with children or people with disability, for instance, need in the context of disaster. Many people would say, oh, why are the animals important? But we do know that generally, even in the rental market, people with animals face a lot of discrimination and difficulty. But we also know that for many people, companion animals are extremely important. For you, could you explain, why for your family that was such an important part of your, housing need?
Sure. So my family, as I said, had some impacts already of trauma. Our companion animals provide trauma relief for us. It got to the point after PTSD diagnoses from this disaster that, my children weren't even able to leave whatever dwelling we were in, let alone their room, unless they had that animal with them. The idea of having to be separated, and we did at times have to foster them out, meant that what I noticed from a mental health perspective is sudden massive regressions into behaviors which were trauma impact behaviors of all my children, who suddenly felt unable to cope. I myself found that it was very hard to cope when we were separated from our companion animals. They provide incredible amounts of love and calming support from a mental health perspective, but it's also when you're going through something on a daily basis, which is just so harsh and horrible, to have just a little bit of good. And I tell you, those animals bring a whole heap of good every day, means literally the difference between a very stark, cold, horrible reality and one that is just about bearable.
Thank you. I know it's difficult to have to ask you to share that with us, but it's very powerful. It certainly aligns with the research evidence on this, but there's nothing like really explaining, what they mean for people who are directly, going through the experiences that you describe. Look, I do have one question, Doug, if I can ask one more, and I'm going to ask you, Casey, but it might be something that Glenn and Brendan might want to respond to as well. Casey, I think it was you who said to us, there's no sign that anyone is doing any work to make us resilient ahead of the next, to help make us achieve, resilience before the next emergency, a disaster hits our region. And you noted, that you were under housing stress before the flood. I just wonder if you might tell us what, from your perspective, that type of resilience would look like.
I'm really glad that you asked me this, Nicole, because it is something that I myself and many other members in the community have now decided to try and take on ourselves while we're trying to recover from the impacts of this disaster. So first of all, the archaic DA laws that are major barriers, things like multiple occupancy, things like having a secondary or a tertiary dwelling on huge blocks of acreage, half of which aren't being used for farming anymore anyway. This should just be a given. The number of tiny home options that are available to people who can then move on to properties which are out of the flood zone, but can't because of challenges. I know that there was some DA adjustments made, which was really important. However, there were just not enough, and they need to be made to be permanent. So a lot of people I have approached with requests or options asking, could my family, if we can find a way to fund our own home in some way, somehow, a tiny home, and move onto your land, would you have us there? Because these DAs have been waived, and they say to me, unfortunately, time and again, yes, we could, but we're worried about what happens when that temporary DA is pulled. What happens then when you've set yourselves up? And I worry about that too. That's a lot of time, energy, and effort to put in temporary type structures, fencing or whatever it may be. I know that having an open mind to structures and different types of housing, whether it be the housing materials that we use, hemp, which is fire resilient, for example, or homes that are movable on trailers or skids. Encouraging that market and encouraging the opportunity for people like myself who really, when the disaster hit, the amount of resources that my family did have to reach out for and utilize would have cost way more than what could be given to me now to support me to get out of the rental market, to get into one of these types of homes, which would mean that I was no longer a burden on the system when disaster hits. This is what we're looking for. Also looking for retrospective support to fit homes and to help homeowners to fit homes with these things so that, when the grid goes down, maybe you do have power because you've got solar. When the disaster happens or when we're having heat waves, for example, homes are insulated appropriately. So many of the homes in the Northern Rivers region, and anyone who's been renting can attest to this, are just not insulated, let alone well insulated. Yeah.
Thanks, Casey. That's very helpful. Doug, do you, if there's time, I wouldn't mind having a quick last word from Glenn and Brendan about how they are resilient. What would resilience look in the housing space look like for you, Glenn, and then we'll finish off with you, Brendan. You're muted again, Glenn.
Thanks, Nicole. As far as I know, I think the Reconstruction Authority in New South Wales has put out some documentation on technical modifications or design options for existing housing and making it more flood resilient. However, I'm not 100% sure. It's just what I've heard anecdotally. I think in the case of the house that I used to have, because I had to rebuild it to sell it, and I did think, well, if someone wants to buy it, I'm going to need to make it as flood resilient as possible if there ever is another flood over 1 in 100. And so I put cement sheeting in the walls instead of plasterboard, and I kept using hardwood timber instead of pine or plywood. And I couldn't afford to, but my neighbours raised their houses as a contingency if there's another flood like we had in February 22. Yeah, I just want to add to Casey's point around council and state governments being more open-minded about how the housing crisis can be addressed. If there are some homeowners who are more than happy to have someone living in a large caravan or a tiny house on wheels, then why not? If it's going to help someone with their housing stress, if it's going to contribute to reducing the housing crisis, certainly that we have in Northern Rivers, then why not be open to something like that, particularly if the owner, is really supportive of it. If it helps people like us have a simpler, healthier space, then why not? And the last thing I will say is that what are the values that the government and non-governmental organisations, what are the values that are informing these decision-making processes? Is it about profit, or is it about humanity? Is it about compassion? Is it about actually caring about everyone's fundamental right to have somewhere warm, cool, safe to live? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Glenn. And Brendan,
Yes, hello.
hi, can you give us a vision? What would a resilient, home or, the housing system look like for you?
I think for me, people have to understand that my disability is an information deficit disability. If we had had people that understood in the crisis that information was key and providing it early, and providing it simply in different ways instead of visual ways. So in terms of placing information inside an image, how can that be presented in another way, in an audible way or a textual way or some other form? That would be a much more resilient system. And I think connecting people to peers, to other people with the same disability. You talked about, animals before. Obviously, I don't have one, but guide dogs are a huge thing as well. And those provide essential based services, but guide dogs can't even fit into evacuation centres, and they can't even fit under the beds because the beds are not made high enough for the dogs to even get underneath them. So when you're a person with a blindness disability that has a dog, you are immediately guide dog. You're immediately at a significant disadvantage from everyone else because you can't even get into an evacuation centre.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to hand back to Doug. But the three of you have really brought home the importance of lived experience being part of future decision-making processes.
Well, thanks, Nicole, and thanks to Brendan, Glenn, and Casey. I must say I'm struggling to try and find the words to explain how difficult this has been, not only for people who have suffered these floods, but to listen to the difficulties that people had following the floods. Seems to me that what we have is bureaucratic oversight that is not conducive to ensuring there's a bit of compassion and understanding for what's happening. And what's come through very strongly is the issue that the actual flood, as bad as it was, the actual trauma, as bad as it was during the floods, was for some people not as bad as the problems that they faced trying to rebuild their lives after the floods. And Brendan has raised these issues about disability that I'm sure not too many people are thinking about. I mean, floods come, floods go, disasters come, disasters go, but people with disabilities are there and they have to get some better support than what we've seen at the moment. Glenn has raised, living in a caravan for 2.5 years and, 848 days to settle insurance claims, for some of the people experiencing the floods. I mean, these are particularly traumatic issues that people are facing. And, this bureaucratic lack of empathy, Casey has raised that as well. So I think there's a real need to ensure that there is a proper assessment of how people are managing following these floods. And we do need to get flexibility in the system, and we do need more compassion in the system. I want to thank everyone for the submissions that they've made in this session. These are difficult issues to deal with, but they must be dealt with. So on that basis, I think we have to wrap up at the moment. Again, thanks for everyone who have made these very important, very serious very good submissions to the Commission, and we thank you for the help that you've provided us in coming to grips with these ongoing issues, and not just the immediate issues of dealing with disasters. So we might leave it at that. We are reconvening at 2 o'clock, and we will break between now and 2 p.m. Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Thanks. Having formally broken, I can just see that Casey has her hand up.
Thank you so much. I know you need to finish up. I just realized that there was one piece that I'm sure Glenn and Brendan probably would echo here, that was a constant traumatizing factor and that really needs to be paid attention to, which is the paperwork aspect, and how often after the disaster, thanks Glenn, I know you'll know, the amount of times that we had to start from the very beginning and tell our story over and over and over with agencies that do have connection with each other. And there just was such a terrible lack of communication between agencies, and sometimes within the one agency, like within Service New South Wales, I had to tell our story 5 times only to be told that we couldn't be supported for the most part. I mean, that in and of itself is just ridiculous. Yeah. Thank you.
Well noted. Thank you.
Okay, so we will break. And again, thanks to everyone for that session.